The second manuscript seems to have been copied from line 471, as far as line 496. There, I suppose, the charges or regulations have followed, which having been given from the first manuscript, the copyist omitted as a needless repetition, but went on immediately with the ars quator coronatorum. This ended at line 534. It is now evident that he went back to a preceding start of the second manuscript and copied the earlier account of Masonry from line 535 to 576. The bare reading of these lines will convince the reader that they are not in their proper place and must have formed a part of the beginning of the second poem. Line 577 appropriately follows line 534 when the interpolation is left out and then the transcription is correctly made to the end of the poem. The first manuscript was apparently copied correctly, with the exception of the two interpolations from the second manuscript. There is a doubt whether the legend of the crowned martyrs belonged to the first or to the second poem. If to the first, then we have the whole of the first poem, and of the second only the interpolations. This is, however, a mere conjecture, without positive proof, yet it is very probable. On the whole, the view I am inclined to take of this manuscript is as follows. There were two original manuscripts, out of which the copyist made a careless admixture. 2. The first manuscript began with line 1 and went on to the end at line 794, but this is only conjectural. It may have ended, or rather the copying ceased at line 470. 3. If the conjecture just advanced to be correct, then form a second manuscript. The copyist made interpolations in the following way. 4. The beginning of the second manuscript is lost, but from very near the commencement, which probably described the antediluvian tradition of Lamech, the copyist had selected a portion which begins with line 535 and ends at line 576. He had previously interpolated the lines from 471 to 496. We have then the whole of the first manuscript, from the first line to the 794th, with the addition of two interpolations from the second, consisting only of 68 lines, namely from line 471 to 496, from line 535 to 576. 6. The first manuscript is deficient in any references to antediluvian masonry, begins with the foundation of masonry in Egypt, as its title imports. This deficiency was, in part, supplied by the second interpolation, 535 to 596. This part begins with the building of Babel, but it is evident from the words many years after that there was a preceding part to this manuscript that has not been copied. The many years after refer to some details that had been previously made. The account of the 7 sciences found in all later manuscripts is not given in the first poem. It is inserted in this from the second. 7. So of the poem in the form we now have it, parts copied from the second manuscript consist only of 68 lines, which have been interpolated in 2 places into the first manuscript, namely lines 471 to 496 and lines 535 to 576, and these have been dislocated from their proper places. All the rest of the poem continues the original first manuscript. If I hesitate at all in coming to the positive conclusion that the first and last parts of the poem were composed by the same author, it is because the latter is written in a slightly different meter. This, therefore, leaves the question where the first poem ends and where the second begins, still open to discussion. The variations which exist between the Halliwell poem, or rather, poems and other Masonic manuscripts of later date, are very important because they indicate a difference of origin and by the points of difference suggest several questions as to the early progress of Masonry in England. The form of the Halliwell manuscript differs entirely from that of the others. The latter are in prose, while the former is in verse. The language, too, of the Halliwell manuscript is far more antiquated than that of the other manuscripts, showing that it was written in an earlier stage of the English tongue. It belongs to the early English, which succeeded the Anglo-Saxon. The other manuscripts were written at a later period of the language. The Halliwell manuscript is evidently a Roman Catholic production and was written when the religion of Rome prevailed in England. Later manuscripts are all Protestant in their character and must have been written after the middle of the 16th century, at least, when Protestantism was introduced into that country by Edward VI and by Queen Elizabeth. Footnote: Edward VI reigned from 1547 to 1553. Elizabeth reigned from 1558 to 1603. The interval was occupied by the Roman Catholic reign of Mary, but the archaic style of the Halliwell manuscript forbids any theory of its having been written during that intermediate period. The different religious character of the two sets of manuscripts is very patent. We see ecclesiastical influence very strongly manifested in the Halliwell manuscript. So marked is this that Mr. Halliwell supposes that it was written by a priest, which I think is not impossible, although not for the reason he assigns, which is founded on his incorrect translation of a single word. Footnote: a philological note may, here, be not uninteresting. Mr. Halliwell, in support of his assertion that the writer of the poem was a priest, quotes line 629, and when the gospel me read shall, where he evidently supposes that me was used instead of I, and that the line was to be translated, when I shall read the gospel. But in none of the old manuscripts is the flagrant blunder committed of using the accusative me in place of the nominative y or I. The fact is, the Anglo-Saxon man signifying one, or they, like the French on in on it, as man died, one, or they did, or it was done, gave way in early English to me, used in the same sense. Examples of this may be found in the writers who lived about the time of the composition of the Halliwell manuscript. A few may suffice. In the Aenbite of Inuit is the following line: in the Yeld woods me zenith and vif manners, that is, in the idle word one sinneth in 5 ways. Again, in Robert of Gloucester's Chronicle are these phrases: by this tale me may yees, i.e., by this tale may be seen, story of Lear, line 183, and best me may who hem trust, i.e., and they may be trusted best, IB 1, 184. The stood that he was at Islaw me Cleputh, yet Morgan, i.e., the place where he was slain is called Morgan still, IB 1, 213. And the line in the Halliwell poem, which Mr. Halliwell supposed to mean, and when I shall read the gospel, properly translated is, and when the gospel shall be read. It furnishes, therefore, no proof that the writer was a priest. Roman Catholic character of the poem is proven by lines 593 to 692, which are occupied in directions how the Mass is to be heard, and so ample are these directions as to the ritual observance of this part of the Roman Catholic worship, that it is very probable that they were written by a priest. In the subsequent manuscripts, we find no such allusions. Freemasonry, when these documents were written, was Christian in its character, but it was Protestant Christianity. The invocation with which each one begins is to the Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. But no mention is made, as in the Halliwell manuscript, of the Virgin and the saints. The only reference to the Church is in the first charge, which is, that you shall be a true man to God and the Holy Church, and that you use no hearsay, nor error by your understanding or teaching of discreet men. A charge that would be eminently fitting for a Protestant Christian brotherhood. On referring to the first charge adopted after the revival in 1717 by the Grand Lodge of England, we find that then, for the first time, the sectarian character was abandoned, and the toleration of a universal religion adopted. Thus it is said in that charge, though in ancient times Masons were charged in every country to be of the religion of that country or nation, whatever it was, yet 'tis now thought more expedient only to oblige them to that religion in which all men agree, leaving their particular opinions to themselves. Footnote. Anderson's Constitutions, first edition, 1723, page 50. Now comparing the religious views expressed in the oldest Masonic constitutions of the 14th century with those set forth in the later ones of the 16th and 17th, and again with those laid down in the charge of 1717, we find an exact record of the transitions which from time to time took place in the religious aspect of Freemasonry in England and in some other countries. At first it was Roman Catholic in its character and under ecclesiastical domination. Then, after the Reformation, rejecting the doctrines of Rome and the influence of the priesthood, it retained its Christian character, but became Protestant in its peculiar views. Lastly, at the time of the so-called revival, in the beginning of the 18th century, when speculative Masonry assumed that form which it has ever since retained, it abandoned its sectarian character and adopted a cosmopolitan and tolerant rule, which required of its members as a religious test only a belief in God.